December 16th, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes erupted under the heaviest German offensive the U.S. Army would face in the entire war. Over 200,000 German troops, 1,400 tanks, and a blizzard thick enough to blind aircraft. Allied intelligence dismissed the possibility of an attack. Eisenhower believed Germany was finished. Bradley believed the Ardennes was a quiet sector. Montgomery saw no major threat. Only one general had warned his staff 11 days earlier to prepare 3 entire divisions to pivot north on 48 hours' notice. He was laughed at. He was ignored. He was George S. Patton. And he wasn't guessing. His intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, had uncovered a German disappearance act involving 15 divisions that Schaeff refused to believe.
By early December 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, had convinced itself the Wehrmacht was collapsing. Ultra-intercepts had gone silent. Luftwaffe activity had nearly vanished, and every major intelligence summary predicted the Germans were incapable of any large-scale offensive. The Allies believed they were witnessing the final gasps of a defeated army. But this confidence was built on assumptions, not evidence. SHAEF analysts insisted any German movement in the Ardennes was simply defensive repositioning. 15 divisions vanished from regular reporting, yet no alarms were raised. Bradley famously called the Ardennes a quiet front. Eisenhower saw it as a place for exhausted units to rest. The truth was forming right under them. Hitler was concentrating his last reserves for Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive.
In the Third Army headquarters, far from the confidence circulating through SHAEF, Colonel Oscar W. Koch studied the same intelligence summaries everyone else ignored. Koch was calm, analytical, and famously unwilling to accept consensus without proof. As early as December 4th, he briefed Patton that something was wrong. German fuel shipments had increased, traffic behind the Siegfried Line had surged, and aerial reconnaissance showed armored formations quietly massing in forest cover. Koch concluded that the Germans were preparing a major counteroffensive aimed at splitting the Allied line. He even predicted the exact region, the Ardennes. And unlike SHAEF, he had no ideological bias against German capability. Patton did not hesitate. He immediately ordered 3 contingency plans for a northward swing of 3 divisions, even before any attack began. "We will be ready," he told his staff, "even if nobody else is."
While other generals relaxed for Christmas, Patton quietly reconfigured his Third Army's entire logistical posture. Supply officers were told to stockpile fuel and rations without explanation. Staff officers rehearsed pivot movements toward Bastogne and the Ardennes. Patton's divisions, 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, were instructed to maintain readiness for rapid redeployment. To avoid suspicion, Patton disguised these preparations as training movements, but his staff later admitted Patton was preparing for a battle everyone else insisted would never happen. He told his chief of staff, "When the blow comes, it will come in the Ardennes, and when it comes, I want Third Army to hit back hard." When the Germans finally attacked on December 16th, Patton's headquarters was the only Allied command that wasn't caught flat-footed. By 19 December 1944, the Ardennes blow had shattered illusions.
Eisenhower convened his senior commanders in the crisis session, the room filled with maps, tense faces, and 3 uncomfortable truths. The German thrust was larger than expected. Weather-grounded Allied air power and inexperienced American units were being rolled up. Eisenhower, insisting on steadiness, told his staff to view the situation as an opportunity rather than a disaster. The question fell to Patton: how fast could Third Army turn north and strike the German flank? The answer that followed stunned the table.
When Eisenhower asked how soon Patton could counterattack, Patton did not pause. Drawing on days of preparation and rehearsed pivot maneuvers, he answered that he could have forces ready to move within 48 hours and open an attack in roughly 3 days. An operational tempo no one else in the room believed possible. It wasn't bravado. It was the result of deliberate logistics, pre-positioned supplies, and deception that had masked Third Army's readiness. That blunt estimate forced the Allied command to realign priorities, moving men and materiel in winter conditions at a speed rarely seen in modern warfare.
Turning an army 90 degrees is a phrase, but in the Ardennes it meant men, tanks, trucks, and trains executing an impossible ballet across frozen mud and narrow roads. Patton's staff had already sketched contingency routes: rail to forward dumps, nighttime road marches to avoid German observation, and staggered refueling points to keep armored spearheads moving. Signal officers improvised traffic control on single-lane arteries. Reconnaissance parties cleared snowbound obstacles. Within 3 days, columns that had been facing east rolled north, covering scores of miles under blackout restrictions and bitter cold. It was a logistical triumph born of discipline and pre-planning.
Bastogne, a wet tangle of frozen lanes, became the linchpin. On 16 to 18 December, the 101st Airborne and elements of the 10th Armored were cut off and surrounded, short on supplies, short on winter gear, and short on hope. Patton's pivot aimed squarely at that pinch point. As Third Army punched north, liaison officers struggled to synchronize timings. Artillery had to hold until armor arrived. Medics prepared casualty clearing stations. Engineers opened blocked routes. Relief was not instant. The fighting for Bastogne became a race of wills, and trapped paratroopers held the crossroads long enough for Patton's lead elements to close the ring and begin the drive that would blunt the German offensive.
Patton's columns did not march in daylight parades. They moved at night, under blackout orders, with engineers and scouts clearing obstructions by headlamp and shovel. The Third Army's advance began as a staged relay operation. Rail moved men to forward marshalling points. Trucks and half-tracks carried fuel and ammunition to forward dumps. Combat commands set rigid movement windows to avoid traffic jams on single-lane Ardennes roads. Patrols probed for German blocking positions, and bridges were inspected for sabotage. The cold amplified every difficulty. Grease froze in axles, batteries lost charge, and men fought frostbite as much as the enemy. Still, the rehearsed contingency plans let Patton's spearheads close distances measured in dozens of miles rather than weeks, a feat of coordination that stunned Allied planners.
German operational planning hinged on speed and fuel. Without petrol, their panzers were lumbering coffins. The Wehrmacht captured some Allied fuel depots early, but German logistics were fractured. Captured supplies were insufficient, and long, interdicted lines of communication sapped throughput. Bad weather initially concealed movement from Allied air, but it also delayed German resupply convoys and immobilized some transport. Intercepted German transmissions that mentioned fuel shortages had earlier been read by Allied analysts as proof of collapse. In truth, Germany was conserving and prioritizing fuel for the Ardennes spearheads, but not at the scale required to reach Antwerp. The fuel shortfall became a decisive strategic break as the offensive lengthened into late December.
The Ardennes' narrow roads turned into kill zones for the attackers. German armored columns, many of them long, crowded, and traveling on single-threaded lanes, suffered catastrophic congestion when American defenders and terrain forced them to halt. Bottlenecks at village approaches and blocked bridges turned armored breakthroughs into stationary targets, vulnerable to ambush and mechanical failure. Allied units and partisan obstacles multiplied delays. The resulting traffic paralysis squandered hours the Germans could not afford. Every stalled column was another missed window toward Antwerp, and the pause let the Allies gather reserves, bring artillery to bear, and, when weather cleared, unleash air power on exposed formations.
Patton divided his forces into mobile combat commands tasked with specific objectives. Clear the approaches, open corridors to encircled units, and strike into the German flank. Combat Command B and elements of the 4th Armored drove through snow and broken villages to sever German lines of advance. Reconnaissance pushed forward to mark passable routes, while engineers repaired culverts and bridges under fire. Commanders on the ground balanced speed with supply discipline. Overstretched fuel lines could have grounded the advance as quickly as enemy fire. Still, by maintaining pressure and using combined arms teams, 3rd Army gradually wrested terrain back, pried open the Bastogne corridor, and forced German units into an operationally defensive posture.
Patton's relief of Bastogne was not a single cinematic charge, but a sequence of coordinated pushes and hard fighting. The 26th Infantry and armored detachments closed from the south and southeast in a series of local actions, clearing villages and drawing German response. On 26 December 1944, elements of 3rd Army made contact and expanded the corridor to Bastogne, bringing supplies, evacuating wounded, and breaking the immediate siege. The cost was high: frozen casualties, exhausted crews, and shattered materiel. Yet the strategic payoff was clear. Bastogne remained in Allied hands, denying the Germans the crossroads they needed to keep the offensive rolling toward Antwerp.
Allied intelligence had strong technical advantages: ultra-decrypts, air reconnaissance, and captured documents, but it suffered from cultural and analytic blind spots. Analysts interpreted fuel mentions as evidence of collapse. Terrain assessments dismissed Ardennes as unsuitable for a major offensive. Confirmation bias led to discounting anomalous indicators. German deception and strict radio discipline masked preparations. Units moved under camouflage and at night. Some German divisions were reconstituted as Volksgrenadier formations that looked weak on paper but could fight. Colonel Koch's warnings were an exception. He synthesized indicators others had compartmentalized and produced a coherent, bleak forecast. In short, it wasn't a single technological failure, but analytic failures of inference. Human judgments missed what the data, when read differently, actually said.
For a week, the Ardennes skies belonged to weather.
Allied fighters and bombers were grounded just when they were needed most. On 23 December 1944, a meteorological break cleared the ceiling, and Allied air forces reappeared, transforming the battlefield. Tactical air interdiction struck stalled columns, picked off exposed armor, and isolated German supply convoys. Close air support helped infantry hold villages and slowed German reorganizations. The sudden return of air power amplified the consequences of German traffic paralysis. Once exposed columns became targets for fighter-bombers, and the Luftwaffe, already depleted, could not contest the skies. The aerial offensive did not win the battle alone, but it multiplied the effects of Patton's ground maneuver and hastened the German collapse of momentum.
The Bulge exacted a bitter toll. Infantry firms were ground into bloody scrapes. Armored vehicles, clogged with ice and mud, were abandoned or immobile. Artillery barrels cracked in sub-zero temperatures. Field hospitals filled with frostbite and shrapnel casualties. Medics worked around the clock under blackout and bombardment. Logistical attrition, worn tracks, burst radiators, and drained batteries sidelined as much fighting power as enemy fire. For American units, the human cost was measured in thousands wounded and killed, and in exhausted divisions needing rest. Strategically, the battered German formations would never recover full offensive capability. Tactically, the Ardennes prove war's cruelty, where weather and supply are as lethal as bullets.
By late December, the immediate German thrust faltered, and Allied commands shifted from emergency response to consolidation. Patton's thrust had stabilized the northern and southern shoulders of the salient. Artillery arrays were resighted, supply lines shortened, and divisions rotated for rest. Eisenhower and his chiefs discussed exploitation versus prudence, whether to pursue a shattered enemy or rebuild strength for the final 1945 drives into Germany. The consensus favored methodical recovery. Patton kept pressure where prudent, but also readied Third Army for renewed, better-supported operations. The Ardennes episode, once a crisis, had become a hard-won position from which the Allies would resume the march east in the new year.
When bullets fell silent, mechanics and quartermasters took the field. Recovery teams dragged disabled Shermans from mud. Cannons were relined, and railheads received shattered trucks and armor for repair or salvage. The Third Army's logistical engine, the very same machine that enabled a 48-hour pivot, shifted into sustainment mode. Depot stockrooms were inventoried, lost stores replaced, and replacement soldiers funneled to depleted battalions. German units faced a starker fate. Many formations were so consumed in materiel and manpower that even successful tactical withdrawals left them incapable of sustained offensive action. The Bulge had bled both sides. Only the Allies' superior production and lines of communication made continued operations feasible.
Across decades of commentary, Patton's actions in December 1944 elicit polarized admiration and unanswered hypotheticals. Admirers praise his speed, discipline, and will. Patton was a complete warrior, one viewer wrote. Another wondered whether, if unfettered, Patton might have hastened Germany's collapse. Critiques echo too. Some argue his temperament and political instincts required reins. Others point to strategic caution from SHAEF as a check against reckless advances. These public reflections matter because they frame Patton as both the archetypal hard-driving commander and a flashpoint for debates about civilian control, coalition politics, and the proper limits of audacity in war. Patton's legacy is inseparable from controversy. His outspoken views, slapping incidents in 1943, and abrasive diplomacy with allies made him enemies in high places. After the war, conspiracy theories about his 1945 automobile collision circulated. Some viewers still suggest foul play tied to his alleged desire to confront the Soviets. Historian consensus rejects such conspiracies, but acknowledges that Patton's career raises questions about military independence, political oversight, and the price of untempered brilliance. In December 1944, however, controversies receded in the face of a simple fact. Patton's preparedness shortened the crisis and helped steer the Allies back onto the offensive. The Bulge would be remembered as a cautionary lesson in intelligence, logistics, and leadership.
When winter thinned and logistics reasserted themselves, German forces could no longer sustain the salient. Over the first weeks of January 1945, Allied pressure on both shoulders of the Bulge intensified. Artillery concentrations, renewed air interdiction, and incremental armored thrusts pinched German positions. Units that had launched with momentum now found themselves low on men and materiel, and many formations melted away into chaotic withdrawals. The Allies refused to be lured into rash pursuit. Instead, they methodically reduced pockets, restored supply routes, and reclaimed vital terrain. Operationally, the Ardennes became a fight for attrition, in which Allied production and depth of reserves finally overwhelmed the last German gamble.
The Battle of the Bulge was not merely a tactical emergency. It reshaped late-war Allied planning. Eisenhower's staff reevaluated timetables, prioritizing consolidation and deliberate offensives in early 1945 rather than opportunistic thrusts. Political considerations mattered. Coalition unity with British and Canadian partners required coordinated pacing, and the Western Allies had to weigh Soviet maneuvers on the Eastern Front. Patton's rapid response had bought space, time, and options, yet SHAEF chose prudence over overextension. In the months that followed, Allied forces converted the lessons of the Ardennes into improved liaison, refined intelligence tradecraft, and better contingency logistics for winter campaigning.
Colonel Koch emerges from these pages as an archetype of disciplined, analytic tradecraft. His value lay not in prophetic flair, but in method. Synthesizing traffic reports, fuel accounting, reconnaissance returns, and human intelligence into a coherent warning that others had compartmentalized. Koch's intelligence was not flawless, but it was unusually candid and operationally framed. He presented what commanders could act on. For Patton, Koch's work was catalytic. It converted ambiguous indicators into a time-sensitive operational posture. Koch's example would become a case study in military schools on how analytic rigor, clear communication, and credibility with commanders can change battlefield outcomes.
Patton's effectiveness in December 1944 sprang from four interlinked traits: ruthless operational focus, insistence on logistics, a habit of rehearsing contingency moves, and an ability to compel subordinates to meet exacting standards. His temperament, abrasive, impatient, politically tone-deaf, complicated coalition relations and earned him enemies. Yet those same traits produced a command climate where quick, disciplined action was the default. In the Ardennes moment, readiness mattered more than temperament.
Patton's preparedness narrowed Eisenhower's options in a good way. It turned an Allied crisis into a manageable emergency and demonstrated how a commander's culture of readiness can offset intelligence failures elsewhere.
This documentary rests on operational records, unit after-action reports, contemporary headquarters logs, and the testimonies of participants who recorded the sequence of events. The narrative emphasizes primary indicators, traffic and fuel reports, Third Army movement orders, SHAEF minutes of December 19 and Bastogne unit journals. We avoid romanticized counterfactuals. Patton's preparation mattered because it was documented. Orders, supply movements, and rehearsals exist in paper and tape. For viewers seeking deeper study, the primary archival repositories include theater war diaries, the Patton papers, and post-war intelligence reviews that analyze the Ardennes as both a meteorological and analytic failure elsewhere.
Answering the film's central question, Patton was the only senior Allied general who combined an analytically driven warning, Oscar Koch's work, a command culture that rehearsed contingencies, and the logistical muscle to convert plans into motion. SHAEF's error was not technological impotence, but analytic complacency and confirmation bias that misread anomalous signals. Patton's readiness did not spring from mythic bravado. It was the product of preparation, discipline, and a willingness to organize secrecy around movement. The Ardennes tested alliances, intelligence, and supply. Patton's response proved that leadership grounded in operational preparation can, in critical hours, convert surprise into strategic recovery. That is why, on December 19, 1944, when asked how fast he could move, he answered, 48 hours. And for once, the answer was true.